SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today we will be discussing agricultural biotechnology, open source and commons, and we will do so by reflecting on cases from India and USA. When we talk about agriculture, then debates surrounding it can be divided into two broad categories. First, the debates on technological transformation like the Green Revolution and the Gene Revolution, which were done using the biotechnology, where the Green Revolution, by using the high yielding varieties, changes were brought in the production process itself, like the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides were implemented on a large scale, and it was only introduced during the Green Revolution period. And the Gene Revolution was where, using technology, changes were brought within the seed, manufacturing them to become genetically modified seeds. Second is the debates on the intellectual property rights, like the biopiracy, which we were discussing earlier, and the monopoly, where patents were used to control the agricultural production, which also we have discussed in the earlier module. In today's module, we will discuss the different practices of repossession and commonization of seeds in India, which are described in the article that analyzes the two non-governmental organizations like the Loko Samavaya Pratishtana and the Sambhav, both based in the eastern state of Orissa and working towards repossession of seeds. This is an article that was published and was written by me. Further, parallel practices of repossession through the open source mechanisms, analyzing the open source seed initiative in the USA and the open source seed system in the Indian context, will also be reflected to give you an overall perspective. Repossession can take place by changing the mode of production and through open source mechanisms. Foster, deriving from Marx, in Marx's ideas like the poverty of philosophy, used the concept of metabolic rift. Drawing from Marx, Foster believed that capitalism introduces an especially severe metabolic rift in the thermodynamic reciprocity of humans and the habitat. According to Foster, Marx there emphasized the condition of soil degradation that the capitalistic agriculture inflicted through the application of the chemical fertilizers. For him, the unsustainability of the capitalistic agriculture and the rift that the processes create also create the metabolic rift. The process by which people take the nutrient matter and the energy from their environment, digest and give back in return is called as social metabolism. Throughout history, some modes of production and forms of labor have been more disruptive of these material transfers than the others. The sign of this rift are deforestation, loss of soil nutrients, poor air quality, water pollution and erosion, toxic waste, depleted ocean stock, etc. To understand metabolic rift, according to Whitman, scholars should consider how members of society appropriate through labor, the market and the processes involved in the commodification of the nature. Thus, nature cannot be taken as an independent category, since nature is challenged and changed by the introduction of the capitalistic mode of production into the agriculture. The metabolic rift is thus comprehended as the effect of a specified mode of production, namely the industrial capitalism, which destroys the human nature metabolism in an endless pursuit of profit, and this was described by Saleh. Kloppenberg emphasized how the introduction of new technologies and property rights changes the mode of agricultural production in a way that creates the metabolic rift. Kloppenberg's solution to this, therefore, was to move away from the capitalistic mode of production, emphasizing repossession, which, according to him, is the actual recovery or the reacquisition of what has been lost, and even the proactive creation of new common-like spaces in which more than just and sustainable forms of social production might be established and elaborated. To counter the metabolic rift, then there are two ways. One is the commodification of nature and the sustainable production practices based on shared responsibility and common ownership. Repossession then not only operates as a strategy that returns what was once possessed by an individual or a group or an institution into the domain of commons, but also reintroduces in that case the metabolic fit. Thus, when we discuss the appropriation in the field of agriculture, we also find practices that can reverse it by introducing certain mechanisms. To provide you with cases, I will first reflect on Lokosamabaya Pratisthana, an NGO that reacted against the technological development inscribed in the high-yielding varieties, perceived as destroying the ecological system. LSP has the organizational seed banks which are situated at different places in small rooms in various farm outbuildings, huts and houses in Nariso village, Odisha, where traditional varieties of seeds are conserved. For LSP, the ecological damage that the pesticide do to people and to the ecosystem was the major factor impelling a return to the practice of conserving seeds and re-engaging with the traditional agricultural practices. Cultivation of high-yielding varieties require a high amount of pesticides and fertilizers application, which creates the ecological losses. Thus, it was the ecological losses caused by the cultivation of the high-yielding varieties that led the LSP's founder, Mr. Natwar Sarangi, to look for the alternatives or alternative means of doing agriculture. The use of improved variety was seen as creating the metabolic rift between the nature and society through the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides required by the new varieties. Sarangi looked for closure of this rift through natural farming and adopting ecological ways of doing agriculture. He found that the main requirement was to use the land resist varieties, which do not need intensive pesticides and can be cultivated using the natural inputs like the neem cakes as pesticides and the cow dung as the manure, and inspired by the ethos of organic farming, began looking out for the land resist varieties in the nearby areas and then saving and storing them in their organizational seed banks. Motivated to challenge the institutional practices of the high-yielding varieties, Sarangi started by collecting and sharing land resist varieties with interested farmers. Then, over a period of time, he was able to appoint a few people to collect the land resist varieties, using their informal networks, first from different villages and then from different states. The collection and expansion through informal networking was to become the LSP strategy. The second case from India is of Sambhav. Sambhav is an NGO with organizational seed bank with the major objective of collecting and conserving land resist varieties for protecting the environment by conserving the agrobiodiversity. Sambhav founders visualize the rift between human and nature in terms of loss of agrobiodiversity through chemical farming. Sambhav focuses on issues of forest conservation, ecological agriculture, biodiversity and water sanitation. It adheres to the practices of ecological farming, which demands to support the conservation of the land resist varieties. Sambhav collected the seeds which are now stored at Sambhav's organizational seed bank in order to bring more and more seeds to the organization and ultimately to the farmers. The members of Sambhav collected seeds from wherever they could and whichever means they could from all over the India. Thus, collecting landrace variety seeds, Sambhav gradually became able to challenge or change the use of high-yielding varieties. This informal networking served as an important means of collecting and sharing traditional varieties for the use locally and beyond, instead of seeds or the high-yielding varieties developed through the public institutions with international collaboration. Here we find the usage to reconnect resources like the landraces seeds with the farmers through conservation and sharing by both the NGOs as a tool countered the metabolic rift created by the high-yielding cultivation and the association with the agrobiodiversity loss. The objective of LSP and Sambhav in collecting different varieties to enrich their seed collection and protect agrobiodiversity also leads to an act of reposition, where the increase in the use of landraces varieties by the farmers enables them to reclaim their control over the resources, that is the seed. This returns to the farming community a freedom that they had lost earlier, and even extends it through the varieties that grow well locally. This transformative role cannot develop unless the seeds are shared and the practice of conserving and cultivating the landraces varieties spread across different regions. The informal seed networks through which LSP and Sambhav share seeds are thus a vital aspect in their activation as agents of social transformation. Summarizing the struggle of both the NGOs challenging the use of high-yielding varieties and the loss of agrobiodiversity, it can be characterized into two types. First is finding materials, that is the landraces varieties, and second is organizing to conserve these varieties, like within their organizational seed banks. Extending the network of seed conservation by sharing with other stakeholders, through this struggle, seeds are reclaimed from the private and the public sphere for sharing, and thus they become agents of social change and for the commonization. Now let us discuss cases on open source, that is open source seed initiative of the United States and open source seed system that is based in the Indian context. The open source movement gradually made its way into the agricultural sector. Any project needs to possess certain characteristics to qualify as an open source project. Among them, some of them are a full disclosure of the data or information, including the documented source code. This ensures the sharing of data or information. Use of legal instrument, that is copyleft license. This ensures permissive rights to the users of the shared data or information, as well confer some responsibilities on the users of the shared data or information. And the third, creating commons. Here a set of resources which are shared remain accessible to all. Open source agriculture is more of a restoration than a revolution, as agriculture always develops on sharing and exchange of seeds and material. This was according to Beutinger and Wright. The open source tool thus encouraged and rewarded the sharing in agriculture through open source licenses to preserve rights of the users as opposed to the restrictive rights that were provided by the intellectual property rights, according to Kloppenburg. The open source seed initiative and the open source seed system are examples of these indirect approach aimed at repossessing seeds from the restrictive intellectual property rights by use of the open source license. The open source seed initiative of the USA aims at repossession of seeds by denying the corporate dominance created by the intellectual property laws. In contrast to the closed system of intellectual property rights, OSSI seeds remain as a protected common for further use. OSSI also uses laws and gaps in the current IPR system to approach its goal indirectly, working through the legal rights by using a license system that broadens the horizon of access and sharing, like that of the open source software we discussed earlier. This repossession of open source system Thus, the reposition of open source seed initiatives challenge the restrictive institutional arrangements such as that of the intellectual property rights. OSSI is primarily motivated to employ mechanisms to use the plant material for the goal of breeding. OSSI, in its approach to reposition, creates networks of individuals and organizations that adhere to the common goal of denying monopoly of private companies through the intellectual property rights in agriculture, defending their autonomy in the breeding process. The reach of OSSI and the target groups are still not fully established, though it does function in a way that caters to the need of the farmers as well as the plant breeders. However, seed industries can also be one potential user, which again introduces the possibility of monopoly in terms of collecting royalties. In India, the introduction of new technologies like the genetic modification is visualized as a potential threat to the freedom and autonomy of farmers. Initiatives like OSSI, which place no restriction on the derivative use of the resource under the protected commons and its application in agriculture, including genetic modification, may be regarded as a contradictory to the goals of the grassroots organizations in the Indian context. On 30 to 31st of August 2014, the Organic Farming Association of India organized a workshop aimed at finding ways to go about dismantling the industrial monopoly of seeds through the introduction and the development of open source seed system in India. The initiative developed the open source seed system in India occurred as a reaction to the introduction of intellectual property rights, particularly addressing the drawbacks of the Indian Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act and the Biological Diversity Act. According to the CSA report, the provision of PPV and FR Act in respect to the intellectual property rights provide only residual rights to the farmers, concentrating the major rights on the breeders and the researchers, which open source seed system aims to address by broadening the privileges of the farmers. Various NGOs working on the conservation of plant genetic resources through the in situ seed banks felt the need of developing an alternative institutional framework for the farmers that will combat the negative effects of the existing legislation. Thus, the Organic Farming Association of India conception of open source seed system included the formation of a common pool based on the open source principle through the use of general public license of the plant germplasm, that is GPL-PG, as was advocated by Michaels in 1999. The open source seed system does not develop a license of its own, but rather relies on the GPL-PG for sharing of and access to seeds. According to the CSA report, the general public license does not require new legal institution as it operates through the material transfer agreement, which is well established in the Indian context. OSSI, by contrast, is based on the principle of open source with a royalty bearing license, which is developed under the OSSI. These differences in the choices of OSSI and OSSS can be seen as a reflection of their socio-political context. One of the important difference between the open source seed initiative and the open source seed system is that the open source seed system aims at developing a value for cultivation and use, which is known as VCU, data for seeds under open source seed system, which is absent in case of open source seed initiative. VCU data is compiled by the farmers themselves, delineating the plant characteristics, value for cultivation under specific agroclimatic conditions, and value for use like food, fodder, cultural, commercial, medicinal, etc. In fact, the farmers have documented data related to some varieties of paddy, cotton, chili, millets, pulses, wheats, vegetable and maize in this regard. This attempt of open source seed system also connects the varieties with the farmers and their knowledge further providing data to the farmers that can help them in deciding which variety to choose from for their cultivation and breeding processes. For the implementation of open source seed system in the Indian context, the CSA report advocated the development of open source principle through a seed network called the Open Source Seed Network or OSSN. This network comprises of 4 teams functioning to maintain the different aspects of implementation of open source seed system in India. These teams focus on one of the conservation and revival of seed, generation of VCU, participatory plant breeding and farmers varieties, and seed multiplication and distribution. It should also be noted that open source seed system visualizes the public sector as one potential partner along with the farmers for open source plant breeding. Open source seed system advocates for participatory varietal development along with the public sector to enrich the breeding process. The idea of open source seed network is to form the basis for coordinating efforts of various NGOs and public sectors at national level. Here therefore, we find the creation of a space of commons where individuals and groups negotiate and defend their common lived experiences. Individual and groups sharing this space are thus connected through a new kind of or through a new culture of relatedness, in which the farmers' linkages are based not on kinship or biology, but through a common management of other biological species, that is the plant and the seeds. And this common culture or new culture of relatedness was given by Astera. Rather than the traditional static social relations of family and village, it is the active dynamic of what farmers do, their farming practice, that connects them. It is also interesting to find that the open source seed network plans to bring in the public plant breeding sector into the network, finding similarities between the motives, that is, developing varieties without restrictive rights of the two. One important difference between the approach of open source seed initiative and open source seed system is that the open source seed system looks at the farming community as an important creator and facilitator of its initiative, whereas open source seed initiative approach considers the plant breeder as the important for facilitating the open source seed initiative, being based in the United States context. Referring to the practices of the two NGOs that were studied here, we find a different understanding of repossession in case of open source seed initiative. With the introduction of open source into the seed management, seeds tend to be seen as protected resource under the state law, whereas the two NGOs still regard seeds as a common property to be shared and used when community having rights over the resources. The NGO employ the more direct mechanism of an informal seed sharing system through networking and focus on changing agricultural production without giving much consideration to the legal mechanism. Thus, the two NGOs cater directly to the needs of the farmers and exchange materials based on the principle of double the amount or for relatively small payment. On the contrary, the open source seed initiative is primarily motivated to employ the open source to use plant materials for the goal of breeding, which again is quite different from the goals of the two NGOs for maintaining diversity. The open source seed system being developed in the Indian context has included some functions of the two NGOs, that is grassroots network model including farmers and the farming community, and the open source seed initiatives like functions on the open source principles through the use of GPLPG as its strategy to repossess seed. Thus, it appears that OSSI, OSSS and the NGOs understand that access and freedom are the two pillars for seed repossession, but their approach to achieving access and freedom for seed repossession is again very different. Repossession of seed in these cases also act as the first step towards commonization of the resources and bringing in the metabolic fit. Through these cases, we can see how open source and commons are operating in the agricultural field, where the idea of bringing in commons or commoning the seed for all the 4 cases are the same. Thank you for listening and have a great day ahead.